Actually going to start a series in Luke 15. And in Luke 15, it's a series of 3 parables. And the main parable is going to be the prodigal son. So we want to work our way to that point. But the first parable we're going to look at is going to be the lost sheep. And just to get it all in its context, I put a little slideshow together. Just if you're wanting to take notes, or if even online, when we put it up, you'll be able to see those same notes. That way you can glean a little bit more from it if you want to. So right now we'll go ahead and we'll read the parable, and then we'll just start to break it down. So again, in Luke 15, the parable of the lost sheep, it says, "Then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes complained, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.' So he spoke this parable to them, saying, 'What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. I say to you that likewise there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over the 99 just persons who need no repentance.'" So already, the parable is focusing on the joy. We look at it and we say, well, it's about the lost sheep, but when we get down to it, it's about the joy. So I want to keep that in mind as we go forward. So right now we're going to look at some historical context and background just to paint the picture, because I believe if we can get that parable and put it in its right perspective, instead of trying to bring it into today, we need to go back into that time period so we can better understand it. And so again, Luke is the one who actually penned this. He was the author of the Gospel of Luke and companion of the Apostle Paul, written to Theophilus. The reason, Luke's point in writing this document to show Jesus' concern for the Gentiles and outcasts of society. And when Luke actually penned this document in the early 60s, 60 to 62, where and why, Luke wrote to no specific location, but to inform Theophilus and give testimony to the gospel. And so now that we know that part of the aspect of it, now we kind of dig a little bit deeper into what that parable actually means, and the who, what, where, and why about it. And so who told this parable? It was Jesus. What was the reason that he told this parable? Jesus was constantly interacting with those on the margins of Jewish society. So that was a reason of kind of prompting him to tell this parable. Where was he located when he wrote this parable or told this parable? He was actually on his way to Jerusalem. And we know that because in Luke chapter 9, verse 51, it says, "Now it came to pass, when the time had come for him to be received up, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem." And why did he tell or teach this parable? To show the Father's love and acceptance for the outcast and the lost. And just building up to this, in the previous chapter, Jesus was already eating with the Pharisees. He was invited to one of the Pharisee rulers of the house, and he was supping with them and began to teach. And also Luke is the gospel with most of the parables in it. So there's a lot of good teachings there. So Jesus actually moves from one Pharisee's house. He begins to eat and teach there. Then he just kind of moves a little bit further along. And to get a little bit more of the cultural context, because this is going to be important, especially when we go into the prodigal son a little later. The cultural context is to understand that the real significance of the opening verse in chapter 15, we must consider that the Jewish culture is a shame and honor driven society that used shame and honor in a way that developed a sort of social class system. So practically everything that is done in Jewish culture brings either shame or honor. The primary motivation for what and how things are done is based on seeking honor for oneself and avoiding shame. This was the central and all-consuming preoccupation of all Jewish interactions. So again, it was a shame and honor thing. It was shameful to break away from the Lord or not obey a command, but it was honorable to at least try to keep up with these things. And so this is how they would begin to base their judgment on people. The religious leaders in Jesus' day divided up into two groups. This is how they would look at the people. First one, you were either the clean or unclean. You were either righteous or unrighteous. And they wanted to be clean and righteous so that they tried to live separately from people. And this is the religious leaders. People, they thought were unclean and unrighteous. Some rabbis in Jesus' day took this idea so seriously that they refused to even teach people they thought were unclean and unrighteous. And a little further studies and a writing that I seen, there was a quote that I wanted to bring out, and it says, and this is what the Jewish religious leaders would teach: "Let not a man associate with the wicked, not even bring him the law." So this was hard for those who were on the outcasts, who were on the, again, fringes of the Jewish culture, to even receive the truth, because the religious leaders didn't even want to acknowledge them. They didn't even want to be around them. And so before we break into a parable, just a quick definition. The Greek word is parabole, a placing of one thing the side of another, a juxtaposition, a comparing or comparison of one thing with another, likeness, similitude, a narrative fictitious but agreeable to the laws and the usage of human life, by which either duties of men or the things of God, particularly the nature and history of God's kingdom, are figuratively portrayed. And on the bottom, I put a little in, it's an earthly story with the heavenly meaning. And so the first two parables draw the Pharisees in. And the way they do that is Jesus draws them in by posing a question. And so once he's able to draw the Pharisees in with that question, then he kind of poses another question, is what if you were that person? And so here, again, leading up to this point, when Jesus is beginning to teach, again, just the previous verse, he was already hanging out with the rulers and the Pharisees, and then he kind of broke away. And then he got into a really, really deep teaching about discipleship and what it meant to follow after him. And you would think that after these hard teachings and what the cost of discipleship, that some people would break away, like, no, I'm not doing that. It's too hard for me. But instead, it says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. So I thought that was interesting, that after he talks about discipleship and he talks about the cost of discipleship, you would think that the crowd would scatter a little bit, but they didn't. They drew in more. And then not only that, but the Pharisees were really intently watching and listening. Not because they wanted to learn of what Jesus was saying, but they were looking for a way to find him guilty so they can crucify him. And they were already on that mission. So they weren't really listening. They were more like stalking Jesus to see if they can catch him in a lie or teaching something false. And again, this verse says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And it wasn't that Jesus was condoning what the sinners were doing, or he was involving himself in what the sinners were doing, but he was teaching them how to live a holy life. And just 10 chapters before, in Luke 5:29, it reads, "Then Levi gave him a great feast in his own house, and there were a great number of tax collectors and others who sat down with them. And their scribes and the Pharisees complained against his disciples, saying, 'Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?' Jesus answered and said to them, 'Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance.'" And so he was already privy to what they were trying to do. This wasn't the first time that he's heard him complaining, but again, he hears them in the background. And it's not like they were whispering, complaining, like, "Oh my gosh, this dude's..." No, they were loud about it. They were complaining, so much so that as he was teaching, he's like, "Okay, I got one for you." And then he breaks into his parable. And so we're going to begin to, before we break into the parable, let's look at the characters here, because we have the tax collectors and sinners. We have the Pharisees and the scribes. I know it says teachers of law, but they were the scribes as well. So the tax collectors were very despised. When Rome began to occupy the Jewish land, they were gathering taxes. They needed people to gather the taxes for them. And some Jewish people would go and say, hey, I'd do it. And they would gather the taxes. And they would tax their own people for Rome, but then they would overcharge so they can have something for themselves. And so they were despised. And they were looked at as traitors of their own people. You know, how could you do that to us? I thought you were one of us. So they were not like, they were just coupled in right with the sinners. Sinners were those who really necessarily couldn't keep the law, or even maybe didn't even try to keep the law. And so now we look at the Pharisees, or the teachers of the law, and the scribes, religious leaders of Jesus's day. They decided to live as much as possible in complete separation from the unclean. They were self-righteous, and we see a little bit of this in Matthew 23:5, because their self-righteousness was on the outside. Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5 says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and Sadducees, you will in no way enter the kingdom of heaven. And the way they would show their righteousness, again here in Matthew 23, it says, but all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge their borders of their garments. A phylactery was something, a leather box that they would put on their head in the morning, and there would be Jewish prayers, and they would broaden this thing. It'd be huge. And then they would lengthen their tassels, is another way to say it, instead of broadening their garments. And so they would have long tassels with their robes, this big old thing on their head. And when you see them, you would think, wow, that guy's really holy. He's somebody, he's something. But it was all a facade. It was all just for show. And so now that we kind of get the characters down, let's kind of break into the parable. So he says, what man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which is lost until he finds it? And so a running theme that I was looking at here is lost, sought, found, and then celebrated. And we're going to see this broken down here. So right now, we're at the lost part. And the word is never mentioned here, but we're talking about shepherds. And so we're going to briefly look at what a shepherd is, what it does. Shepherds were the lowest people, the low life, the scum, the unacceptable, the outcast, the unclean of the society of the Jews. And this would have been very offensive to the Pharisees and the rulers of that day, for them to think, well, you're calling me a shepherd? You know, and again, the shepherds were the ones that they lived outside. They lived with the flock. They would be there from when the sun came up almost till nighttime, some of them overnight. And so they would even smell like the sheep. That's how often they would be around these sheep. Again, they were very despised, and sheep were thought of as the dirtiest animals at the time. And so it was something that the Pharisees, when he would tell this story, they were like, no, a Pharisee being a shepherd, you know, that's not the way it goes. So again, something I ran into, according to Jeremiah, a historian, shepherds were believed to be dishonest, thieves. They were encroached on the land that wasn't theirs to feed their sheep. They were the lowest level of people. These are peasant people, poor people living in a village life. And so Jesus is setting this up into a way where, again, he kind of tricks him into this, because he wants them to understand what he's really trying to say, and we'll get into that. But so he's saying, which one of you, if you had 100 sheep? So already he's placing these Pharisees in that mindset, and he's kind of tricking them to know what the right thing is to do, and he corners them into that place to find the application. And even though they don't like, in their mind, being a shepherd, they know what's right and wrong. So he corners them into that situation. And he says, which one of you having 100 sheep? So no shepherd is going to shepherd 100 sheep. That was just impossible. Usually, again, back in this time, in this culture, when you were going out to shepherd sheep, you would have about 2 or 3 shepherds with you. So when one person would leave to go find it, the other 2 would take the others back. Again, a little bit more about the shepherding before we go any little further. So when you did have shepherds, this was pretty much in a village. So again, no one had 100 sheep. So the village would get together, and they would kind of culminate all their sheep together, consolidate them, and they would hire people to watch after the sheep. The hired people weren't outsiders. They were either relatives or they lived in the village. They would never go outside to find a shepherd. So these people, if you were really well off and you had sheep, you probably had 15 sheep. And this is doing really well. The others, you may have 4, you may have 3. If you didn't have a lot, you may have 2 sheep. And so no one shepherd would have 100 sheep. And Jesus alludes to something here too. He says in John 10 about the hirelings. The hirelings in John 10, when he's talking about the good shepherd, he's saying that they come to kill, steal, and destroy. And so that's how these shepherds were looked at, the hireling shepherds, because they weren't really invested in these sheep. They were there just trying to execute a job and watch. And some of them would even flee if the sheep were attacked. So the villagers would pick someone who was at the lowest level of their social structure in the village and who needed work and who didn't mind the stigmatism that came with the work that they had to do. Also, it was safer to hire someone from the extended family because that person had a vested interest in the value of the sheep. So let's say you were the shepherd and you were watching these sheep and one went off. It was important because if you went to go find that one sheep, it could be to a family that only had 2 sheep. So that was really important that you go find and locate that other sheep. And there weren't really many rules to shepherding. The main dominant rule is if it gets lost, go find it. That was the rule of shepherding. Of course, you're going to look after them. You're going to make sure they're getting fed, watered. You're going to protect them from predators. But the main goal was to not lose a sheep. And in doing this, they would have to go and venture out and find that sheep if one was lost. Again, this is a shame and honor society. So if you were to lose a sheep and you were a shepherd, that was shameful. Because again, you and maybe 2 other guys were out looking at these over the sheep. One gets lost and you didn't come back home with it. Shame on you. You had a job. You were the lowest of low. You said you could do this, but you couldn't even watch over these sheep. That's shameful. And so you would look down upon after that. Go to this next one here. And so the shepherd's job was to go and retrieve that sheep, dead or alive. That's how it was. And if it was dead or alive, you'd have to bring it back. And if you couldn't do that, you would have to bring at least a piece of that sheep back to show, hey, I'm trying to be responsible. I'm being held accountable. All I could bring back was the leg or a piece of the sheep. That way your shame wasn't too low. You actually went and you tried to find this sheep. He lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I found my sheep which was lost." I think that's, okay. And so this is one of the points here. Again, we're looking at it as if we're the shepherd. Because he says, which one of you, if you had 100 sheep, would you not leave the others? So let's think about it like this. We all have jobs. We all have responsibilities. Let's say we worked at a daycare and you were in charge of 15 kids. Let's say 2 of them are yours. You're in a school building. The system comes on, PA system comes on, hey, so-and-so's lost, so you go and you look for that kid because that's your responsibility. If they're in your classroom and you take them out to recess or whatever it is, you come back in and that kid's not there, you count, okay, Billy's gone, where's Billy? I don't know. You're not gonna be like, oh, well, that's one less kid I gotta worry about. No, that's not your kid. You gotta go find that kid because you're responsible for him. So you go out and you do that. And then you go and you find little Billy, he's probably still playing on the swing set somewhere. You don't scold him. Like, oh, I can't believe, some people might. But this guy rejoices. And not only that, but these shepherds, when they had to go find these sheep, it wasn't an easy task sometimes. They would have to trek. And in Matthew 18, Jesus tells the same parable, But he says that he goes into the mountains. And so when they were to find this sheep, he would again lay it on his shoulders and bring it back joyfully. And it wasn't because that the sheep was joyful. It was the guy who found him that was joyful, because again, the shame honor system. And now he can rejoice because someone has their sheep. You know, and again, the sheep were looked at as, you know, they brought milk to the family. They brought clothing with their wool, meat, cheeses. I mean, this was a commodity for them. This is something they needed, something they had to have in that culture. Not only that, but some of them were sacrificed. And so this was a joyful thing. And so when you do find little Billy and you come back to the class and the teachers are, you know, on the PA system looking, and you tell them, hey, found Billy by the swing set. Oh, thank God, yes, don't call his parents, we're good. Maybe we can not tell them what happened. But he finds him and they rejoice. And so to really look at it from another point, I want to look at this now as if we're the sheep. Because Isaiah says, we like sheep have all gone astray. And we may have been the shepherd before, and we're going and seeking and trying to save that which is lost, and that's a great thing. But before we were a shepherd, we might have been a sheep, and we might have been lost deep somewhere. And we pray that someone can help us, someone can find us, because with loss comes despair and hopelessness. And so I want to present a little video, and then we're going to close it out. But I want to look at it through another point, through the sheep. And as she's getting that ready, I had an opportunity to pray with and talk to someone this week, and they just so happened to mention Luke 15 and feeling lost and hopeless and in despair. And this was encouraging to me because I was like, wow, I'm actually about to talk about this stuff. And in doing my little studies, I came across this video, and I thought it'd fit perfect for what we're about to learn as we close this out.
He's forgotten somehow and lost in the forest at least 5 years. I think he was a bit shell-shocked when he arrived. He couldn't really see because the wool had grown over his eyes. It must have been so incredibly painful. The local chap saw these mammoths moving amongst the trees and had to look twice. And it turned out to be the sheep, so he contacted us to see if we could take the sheep on, which we readily said yes. I can't imagine how he survived, but he did. Another sheep was with him, letting him know everything's okay.
This is a good place to be, old mate.
He had over 35 kilos worth of wool on him. That tells how long the poor fellow had been out there. We had to get the fleece off, but we knew that was a huge risk to his health and safety, but leaving it on was a greater risk. It actually took nearly an hour to get it up because we had to go into hand scissors, and it was matted, and he had bits of sticks and twigs, all sorts of things in his wool. I really believe he knew we were helping him. He stood there and let us do it, which was just amazing because he was obviously scared, but he also felt confident in the things that we were doing for him. When we got the fleece off him, we finally relieved him of his burden. As he walked down the alleyway, he started to get stronger in his legs. And he had Chloe and Molly there on the other side so they could see each other through the stalls.
Yeah. That's the best sign.
He just stands there and curiously looks at us. He is so intelligent. He's got a pretty good life now. Certainly got more confident. Barak has evolved every single day into the wonderful being that he is. We are just so grateful that Barak came into our world.
All right. I thought that was a really cool video when I was going through this, and I was like, this is going to be perfect for it. Again, we looked at it through the shepherd's standpoint, or the viewpoint. They were despised, not a very good job to have, lowest of the low, out there sleeping with the sheep. And he's saying, which one of you, if you've lost one of these, would you not go look for it? And again, the Pharisees cornered in that situation. It's like, yeah, okay, I guess if God forbid, I was a shepherd, I would have to go look for it. And so he presents that to them in a way, and they rejoice. The heavenly host, and we'll get to that, but the sheep is what I want to look at now. Because we were all that sheep. And just like in this video, he was lost, he was uncared for, and all that weight he had to carry, 77 pounds of wool. And just like us, or someone we may know, or some people out there even today, they're lost and they're straying away from the truth, and they're crying out. One thing about sheep, and very true, read it multiple times, they're dumb animals. They need guidance. They need someone to shepherd them. The sheep needs a shepherd. And when a sheep was to stray away from the flock, they would begin to bleat, but in the opposite direction, not knowing. The sheep could get so lost, get so tired, and surprisingly, this didn't happen to this sheep, but they would actually just fall and collapse, and they would need help back up. And this would make it easy for their predators to catch them. They have no defense. As you see, the sheep, it's very hard to defend themselves. So they need someone to come out to rescue them. Again, we, like the sheep, before we met Christ, were just burdened down with our sin, with guilt. We didn't want to come to the truth because, like, oh my gosh, I have to face this, and I have to, reality sinks in. And you think, if I come to the truth, and if I come to the knowledge, well, let me get cleaned up first. You can't clean yourself up. You have to come as you are, dirty, filthy. Even if all that guilt and that burden of sin is weighing you down, you have to continue to shout out, to call out to the Lord, your shepherd. And so when the shepherd finds him, again, he picks him up. He usually puts it over his shoulders with the belly on his back here. He'll tie up the feet, and he'll begin to make that track back all the way home. Not angry, not mad, like, oh, I can't believe this sheep. Nope. Thank God I found this sheep. And so he would joyfully bring it back. And the people at the village were probably talking about the rumors. Old Mark over there lost so-and-so sheep. And, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. How are they going to eat now? How are they going to get food? And so when they would see this shepherd coming with the sheep over, maybe it's night, maybe it's getting dark, when they would finally see him coming back in hopes that this sheep was at least still alive, they would begin to rejoice. And then whenever he was able to put it down, untie it, and they would see it run, rejoicing. Because now that which was lost is found. And a little closer look at a messianic view is Jesus came to do just that, seek the lost sheep of Israel. The lost sheep, well, Israel was divided into two kingdoms. Judah actually remained intact with the Levites, but the northern part captive. And so they were lost. And so he came to gather up his sheep. Again, for us today, this is me and you. We were once lost. We were that sheep that went astray, heavy, laden with our burdens. I like what Isaiah says in 49:22, when he talks about the shepherd. He says, "They shall bring your sons in their arms, and your daughters shall be carried on their shoulders. And this is exactly what Jesus is doing. And before, as we know, the cross is a perfect emblem of Christianity. But before the cross, it was actually a shepherd. It was actually a picture of a shepherd with the sheep on him. That was the symbol of Christianity. That's what they used back then. Now, again, today we have the cross, but that's the perfect picture. And so we may know someone, or it could be even us, that we're just feeling really burdened right now. And we feel like, I don't want to get up. And I can't even find you, God. I'm calling out to you. I need your help. I'm spiritually lost. Emotionally, I'm pretty much gone. Physically, I don't want to do anything. And that's exactly where we need to be. And that's when we need to cry out. Just like the sheep would cry out and start bleeding and trying to call out for someone, something to come help them. But thanks be to God for Jesus, the shepherd of our souls. And I like what Paul says here in Romans 5:6, because we've been that lost, weak sheep where we need help. Paul says, for when we were still without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. When we could not do it ourselves, and all we had was a weak voice, Christ came in and laid down his life so that you can be reconciled, that you can be brought home to the Father. And again, we have this mission as Christians. We may not all be shepherds. We may find ourselves somewhere in there. But we can't be so high up and think we're much better than anybody else. Again, I want to reference another scripture in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 6:11. In this context, Paul's talking about how we shouldn't take someone to law automatically, how we'll be judging one another. And the people who can't enter the kingdom are the fornicators, the homosexuals. He starts talking about these sinners. And just because we were once that and we may not be anymore, doesn't mean we can't go back out there when we're spiritually strong. So 1 Corinthians 6:11 says, and such were some of you, but you were washed, but you were sanctified, but you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus and by the Spirit of our God. Because we were all in that position. We were all that sheep that went astray. And we didn't want to follow a shepherd. We didn't want to be told what to do. And we were laden with our sin and the guilt. And we didn't want to come to church. We didn't want to open our Bibles because it didn't even make sense to us. And we were weak. And again, when we were without strength, in due time, Christ died for you, for us, so that we can be reconciled back to the Father. Now, this is just the first part of the series. I prayerfully laid down some groundwork because it's going to get a little bit more intense once we get to the prodigal son. But that is the lesson. I pray that we were able to glean from it, and it is yours.